So I've been getting emails and all kinds of messages from viewers to make the video that seemingly you have all been waiting for. So here we are, the one on Windows 7. You know, the operating system Microsoft released in 2009 that has widely been considered the best version of Windows ever made. And this isn't just the rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia talking. This was quite the popular opinion when the OS was released. Many critics praised the OS for its slick design, easy-to-use desktop interface, and its implementation of features that made it much more similar to other competing operating systems of the time, such as Apple's macOS X. In fact, NBC News columnist Gary Krakow described his first experience with Windows 7 as clean, clear, and just a pleasure. He went even further to explain that Windows 7 was a terrific operating system, and that it apparently took Bill Gates leaving the company for Microsoft to finally get it right. Now, if you've seen my other videos on Windows, you may know this statement as being in reference to Microsoft's previous OS release, Windows Vista, which at a superficial glance looks and operates practically identical to Windows 7, with both systems even boasting the famous arrow theme. Yet just 3 years earlier, Krakow had described Windows Vista as one of the worst operating system experiences that he'd ever encountered. I mean, surely they can't be that different, right?
Actually, yes. And don't call me Shirley. Airplane. Now, all this might seem a bit like deja vu, and calling Windows 7 more or less a rebranded version of Vista would be very reductive and not telling the full story. But still, the failure of Windows Vista does play an integral role in Windows 7's success. But at the same time, just from looking at it, it's really hard to see why that's the case. When we look at an operating system like Windows Vista in retrospect, we can really appreciate it for just how many great features it introduced that we take for granted today. When Vista was first released in 2006, Windows XP was the most commonly used operating system in the world, and Vista solved a ton of its problems. A more contemporary design, a super fast search bar being built into the start menu, faster file navigation, just to name a few. Yet Vista would become an object of scorn and ridicule, while Windows 7, which possessed all these same features, would be met with unanimous love and praise 2 years later. Why? What happened? Well, that's what this video is about. Today we will be diving into the history behind one of Microsoft's most revered operating systems, and how its design would lay the foundation for all future Windows releases, including the ones that we use today. Now you're probably wondering why I'm in front of the camera all of a sudden. Well, I'm lonely and I need friends, but also it's because I just cannot contain my enthusiasm for ground news. Now looking at the news can be just so frustrating because people are so busy shoving their views down your throat rather than telling you the full story. But Ground News is a platform that allows you to compare articles from multiple news sources to help you find the one that has the least amount of bias. Now I know we've talked in the past about how Gary Krakow really wasn't a fan of Windows Vista. Well, during my research I came across this article from just 8 months later where he describes it as a good operating system. What? Gary! Alright, how much did Bill Gates pay you to write that? No, but what's really great is that Ground News provides you a homepage of all the latest stories with a percentage of where its sources lean politically. In this case, 74% of them that covered this story are politically in the center. And when I click on this, it shows me each source's political bias, which one submitted first, their level of credibility, etc. I can also compare other articles covering the same story. But politics can get annoying. Well, Ground News also gives you the option to choose your own topics, and they don't have to be political. Here I am looking at articles on Windows 7, and I can find other sources covering the same story. They also have a browser extension where you can see the level of bias on an article as you're viewing it. And now you too can get access to transparent news coverage. By visiting ground.news/nationsquid, you can sign up for free or subscribe for unlimited access to the latest news while avoiding all the bias. Be sure to check it out. In the simplest of terms, the success of Windows 7 relied on 3 big components: It came out at exactly the right time, it facilitated the Windows experience, and of course, well, nostalgia. But obviously that leaves out important information, and there's a lot more to the story than that. To fully understand how these three factors come into play requires diving deep into Windows 7's development history, which not only started before the release of Vista, but even before the release of XP, all the way back in 2001. Now, Windows 7's development started at around the same time as Vista's, but Microsoft wasn't aware of this at the time. In a lot of ways, Windows 7 was kind of created on accident, at least the version of it that we recognize today. You see, back in the 90s, Microsoft had a very different vision of what direction they wanted Windows to head in for the next decade. They were going to release 3 versions of Windows throughout the 2000s: Windows Whistler, Windows Longhorn, and Windows Blackcomb. Now, I've already gone into great detail on what happened with these 3 versions of Windows in my video on Windows Vista, so I will try to sum this all up as quickly as I can. But if you'd like to learn more about that, go ahead and check that video out if you haven't already. You might notice that I am mentioning Windows Vista a lot in this video, and that's no coincidence. There is a ton of overlap between Vista and 7. In short, there were a ton of factors that interfered with this vision for Windows that Microsoft put together. Primarily bad planning and perfectionism. First off, 2 of these releases were meant to be big, entirely new versions of Windows, Whistler and Blackcomb. Windows Longhorn was essentially just going to be an incremental update, kind of like the equivalent of Microsoft releasing Windows 98 and then releasing Windows 98 SE a year later. They're different, but more or less the same. Whistler would go on to be released in 2001 as Windows XP. And now the next big version of Windows was going to be Blackcomb, scheduled for release in the second half of 2002. But Windows XP had literally just come out. Did it really make sense to create a big, whole new version of Windows, only to come out with another big release hardly a year later? That just simply isn't enough time for the public to get accustomed to things, not to mention that hardly gives them any time to complete Longhorn. Microsoft realized their plans were way too ambitious and that they were moving way too fast. So, they decided to postpone the release of Blackcomb and to focus more on their smaller release, Windows Longhorn. And that was their next problem. Keep in mind that in the 2000s, computer software was advancing at an alarming rate. So Microsoft had a lot of fun coming up with new, innovative features for Longhorn. A little too much fun. Over time, Longhorn essentially became a pet project for the company, the version of Windows that would encompass every digital fad of the aughts. Word was now getting around about Longhorn, and even some leaks of it surfaced online. As they continued adding on feature after feature, this would only continue to push Blackcomb's release date further and further, until it was pretty much left up in the air. Eventually, this would happen to Longhorn as well, as the more features they added, the more time they needed to actually complete it. The Longhorn project got way too ambitious, to the point where Microsoft didn't even know what direction they wanted the OS to head in. They even completely restarted the project in 2004, this time leaving in only some of its features and changing the name to Windows Vista, and it would finally be released in January of 2007. Given that it took Microsoft 5 years to release what was supposed to be a small update for Windows, only for them to completely scrap the project altogether and then release something that barely even worked on your average Joe's computer in 2007, yeah, it's no wonder that people were mad and hated Windows Vista. The entire ordeal was a disaster for Microsoft, and now, nearly a decade later, people were still using an operating system from 2001. They had to figure out a way to reverse this before Microsoft fell behind with the times. It was time to finally start working on Blackcomb, which had just been renamed to Vienna just a year prior. That name wouldn't last very long though, as the project would be cancelled altogether. Microsoft felt that the project included way too many features for it to be realistically released on time. So, it was then replaced with a new project, codenamed Windows 7. It would later be confirmed by Microsoft that this would be the official name of the OS, not just the codename. And Bill Gates emphasized that Windows 7 would be designed to be a user-centric operating system. And that means what you think it means. Compared to Vista and even XP, Windows 7 was going to be much cleaner, easier to navigate. It was also going to be much faster than Vista, even if you ran it on the same hardware. which means stronger performance, more bang for your buck, and most importantly, it was just going to be better. Your overall experience with Windows 7 would just be more superior than any other Windows before it, because these are the exact things that users want. We will get more into detail later on what these improvements were. But Microsoft was already heading in the right direction. Rather than just arbitrarily throwing in new features to see what would stick, they instead focused on features that they knew would serve their overall goal for the operating system. Just like always, Windows 7 would be continuously improved upon with new builds that would be created over time during its development, many of the early ones looking strikingly similar to Windows Vista. And that's the way it usually works when a new version of Windows is created. Early builds of XP resembled 2000, early builds of Vista resembled XP, and especially in this case, early builds of 7 would resemble Vista. A beta version of the OS would be officially released by Microsoft, giving the public a taste of what the next Windows would be. The release included a very punny beta fish as the wallpaper, and the build was met with a lot of praise. Everything was finally ready. And on July 22nd, 2009, Windows 7 was released. And it did extremely well. In fact, sales for Windows 7 were 234% higher than Windows Vista's during their first weeks respectively. It even surpassed Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows as the biggest grossing pre-order product of all time. Microsoft was obviously hoping for Windows 7 to do well, but they weren't expecting it to do this well. But from looking at the OS's development, we can see why this was the case. The development of Windows 7 after Vista's release was a lot quicker than Vista's development after XP was released. It didn't take, 5 years. And a wait time like this makes a huge difference for people. By late 2006, early 2007, because there had been no big releases of Windows at that time, people were already very accustomed to XP. On top of that, Windows Vista really did not follow the best marketing during its pre-order days. Many of those who were following the development of Longhorn and saw the negative reviews that came out about Vista's beta release just didn't think that buying the OS was worth it. And for the rest of the public who actually did want a new version of Windows and wanted to pre-order Vista, well, they literally couldn't. That's because Microsoft literally stopped pre-orders for Vista. They argued that they wanted to hold off on doing Vista pre-orders so that they could level the playing field for other competing vendors. So yeah, if you combine these factors with the fact that Windows 7 just had a much more elegant entrance into the computing world and was being offered for pre-order at a discount, it's no wonder pre-orders did so well. Windows 7 would very quickly surpass Windows Vista in market share, and even surpass Windows XP just 2 years later. Looking back at the OS in retrospect, you can make the argument that Windows 7 would not have succeeded in the way that it did if it hadn't come out at the time that it did. As we've mentioned before, Windows Vista absolutely did have its problems, but a big part of its tarnished legacy was just bad luck. Windows Vista was both ahead of its time and behind it. Let's go ahead and compare the hardware requirements for Vista and 7. Notice how Windows 7's hardware requirements are only marginally higher than the requirements for Vista. Now compare Vista with the hardware requirements for XP. We see an astronomical difference. The point is, in 2007, buying a computer with these bare minimum requirements was much more expensive. Considering that the majority of users at the time were still on XP, they likely still had systems much weaker than this. And let's face it, the average person doesn't really research what hardware they need before upgrading their software. They just do it. So when they upgraded their incompatible machines to Vista, it was just a disaster. But remember, technology advances exponentially. So 3 years later makes a huge difference. In 2009, systems with these specs are not only much cheaper, but a lot more common. The idea of an OS like Vista doesn't sound as impractical anymore, but its reputation is way too ruined for it to recover. So people just buy the new and fresh Windows 7 instead. So what do the Rolling Stones and Windows 7 have in common? Time is on their side. Yes, it is. But Windows 7 actually did solve very real problems that only existed in Windows Vista by the nature of its design. Vista was a byproduct of the Longhorn project, which tried way too hard reinventing the wheel. This alone gave Vista a rocky start on what exactly it was trying to be. Windows 7, however, was built on the sole mission of solving a problem: the Windows Vista problem. So what problems from Vista did it fix? Well, to give a non-exhaustive list, Windows 7 massively improved user account control, a feature designed to prevent malware from infecting your system by giving the user direct consent to run a program. But often, it was just very annoying and popped up all the time. Windows 7 gave users more options for how often and when they wanted the prompts to come up. Because of this, these pop-ups only occurred a third of the time within Windows 7 compared to Vista. But this by no means made Windows 7 less safe. If something bad did end up going through, you had Windows Defender, which was basically a built-in antivirus program for Windows to quickly put a stop to it. Now keep in mind that Windows Defender only monitored spyware during the Windows 7 days, but still, it was better than nothing. Users could always install free versions of programs such as Malwarebytes to be on the lookout for anything else. So at the end of the day, giving users the option to adjust their user account control settings wasn't that big of a deal. Of course, it is safer to keep the Always Notify setting on, but at least users now had more of a choice. Although Windows Defender was technically introduced with Windows Vista, given everything we've just talked about, Windows 7's much bigger presence was what ultimately introduced it to the masses. Many people, for the first time, had access to features that would otherwise be typically found behind a paywall with your typical antivirus program. Another great feature was libraries. Although a pretty small change, it would prove to be extremely helpful in the long term. Libraries was simply a page in Windows Explorer that contained your documents, music, pictures, and videos folders. Users could also add their own folders to this page as well. This made organizing and navigating files so much easier than ever before. And so did Gadgets. While it didn't host your files, Gadgets allowed users to quickly gain access to widgets where they could look at their calendar, check the weather, use a calculator, etc. They could even manually install their own third-party gadgets. Windows Vista had introduced something similar with their sidebar feature, but this was a bit more distracting and not as customizable. Instead of having to find these programs individually through the Accessories tab or even having to go online, all they had to do was just go to their gadgets, and it would show up. And now my personal favorite feature of Windows 7, the Superbar. Not only does it take Windows Vista's skeuomorphic look to a whole new level, it now shows your programs in icon form rather than text, making it much faster to find things if you have a bunch of programs running. But the best part of all, Windows 7 would introduce the Pin to Taskbar feature. One of the great decisions that Microsoft made with Windows Vista was that they introduced the Smart Search tool, just a little after the release of Apple's macOS X Tiger, which introduced Spotlight Search. And now, with 7, Windows users essentially got their own version of the dock. The ongoing competition between Apple and Microsoft was really getting strong here, and there were now striking similarities between their operating systems. Now, I'll speak for myself here when I say that Windows 7 was ultimately what made me more tolerable of Windows machines. I was a Mac user when Windows 7 came out, and although I didn't hate it, I was never the biggest fan of XP. Especially that horrid excuse of a search tool. At least the dog was cute. And on top of that, I didn't really use Windows Vista a whole lot when it was around, and Windows XP just always felt dated to me. I remember in 2006 thinking that Windows XP was old. I never felt that way with Windows 7, so seeing the striking differences between XP and 7 was a big deal for me, and made using Windows much easier and less of a headache. While this is all purely anecdotal, I would not be surprised if this prolonged exposure to a 2001 operating system and the lack of exposure to Windows Vista caused many people to embellish the features of Windows 7. It basically just got all the credit for the stuff that Vista already had. Consequently, people perceive Windows 7 as a much more amazing operating system than it really was. And that's when we get to our last component, nostalgia. It may not feel like it was that long ago, But Windows 7 is already developing an aura of nostalgic sentiments around it. Maybe not at the same level as XP, but it is there. While I personally am not very nostalgic of Windows 7, there is a new generation of people that are getting older and do feel that way. For some of them, using Windows 7 might be one of their earliest memories, and any kind of reminder of it just takes them back to simpler times. And in some ways, they literally were. Windows 7 was pretty much the last version of Windows from the PC era, as around 6 months after its release, the iPad would come out, and now tablets had officially entered the scene by a huge degree. And so, all versions of Windows after that were built to be more tablet and mobile friendly, and a lot of people didn't like that. It's a big reason why Windows 8 flopped, and even Windows 10 had a pretty rocky start. I remember upgrading from 7 to 10 when it first came out, and I hated it. Now, yes, there were tablet-esque computers that ran Windows 7, even XP in some cases, but the point was still made clear that these were PC operating systems. You know, the ones that require a keyboard and mouse. But now that dynamic was beginning to change. So because of that, and the fact that Windows 7 was built to last a long time, like XP, a lot of people just stayed and didn't really worry about it until support ended in 2020. And when it did, that's when they realized that they had no choice but to switch now, and they had to learn something completely new. Because they spent all that time on 7, they had developed a relationship with it, and this had signified the end of an era. And for most people, that is a feeling that is very bittersweet. Yes, it's an opportunity to learn something new in life, but it's now also the time to let go of the past. So in short, what made Windows 7 so great was that it was similar, but also distinct in its own merit. It took something people were vaguely familiar with and retransformed it into something so much better. Microsoft created what Vista was supposed to be, and just the name Windows 7 alone was powerful enough to make that happen. If Microsoft had released Windows 7 as just another version of Windows Vista without changing anything else about the OS, sales undeniably wouldn't have been nearly as big. That's because the Vista reputation was already damaged beyond repair, no matter how capable it actually was. We saw that with the Mojave experiment. Under the name Windows 7, Microsoft got people to think that this was a new Windows, when in many ways, it was really just a rebranding of Windows Vista, just with most of the problems fixed and new features added. It was a bumpy road, but Microsoft finally got what they wanted. There was a YouTube comment that I got that I think sums it up best. Vista walked so that Windows 7 could run. What was your favorite feature of Windows 7? Did you even enjoy it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you never miss a future video.